In this video, we are going to show you how seam allowances work in VStitcher. First, let's look at how we add a seam allowance. We start by selecting the edge where we want to add the seam allowance. Then we go to the Actions part of the context view and select Seam Allowance. We can then set the amount of seam allowance by either dragging the slider or typing in the value. For example, here we're going to add a seam allowance of 1 centimeter. To view the seam allowances in the 2D window, we use this tool on the 2D window toolbar. For seam allowances on the corner of edges, we can adjust the type of seam allowance we would like. We start by selecting the corner point. Then we go to the Point Properties part of the context view and select the allowance corner we want. Now, let's look at how to remove a seam allowance. We recommend that DXF files to be imported into VStitcher should be net pattern. This means that the pattern should be exported from the 2D CAD system without any seam allowances. However, if, for whatever reason, we import a DXF file with seam allowances, we can remove these in VStitcher. Note that it is best if we know what seam allowance was applied. We start by selecting the edge where we want to remove the seam allowance. Then we go to the Actions part of the context view and select Seam Allowance. Since we are removing seam allowance instead of adding it, we type in the appropriate negative number. For example, to remove 1 centimeter of seam allowance, we type in -1 centimeter. The pattern edge shifts inwards. Note that if we have multiple lines with the same seam allowance value, we can select all the lines and make the required changes to all at the same time. In some cases, depending on how the DXF file is created, our pattern pieces may have internal lines to mark the seam edges. In these cases, after removing the seam allowances, we delete these internal lines. We do this to avoid stitching on the internal lines. After removing the seam allowance, notice that the pattern piece's corner point is not shown and the pattern is locked. This is because the corner points and the edges are along the outer area where the seam allowance is. To fix this, we switch lines to sew lines. This puts the corner points on the new edge and converts the seam allowance to a positive value. And that's how you work with seam allowances in an imported DXF file. To finish, here are some tips. We can add or remove different allowance values on different edges of the same pattern piece. If a pattern piece has the same seam allowance value, we can easily select all its edges. We select the pattern. Then we go to the context view and click the Line tab. Now all edges are selected and we can add or remove seam allowances as we want. In this video, you have learned about adding and removing seam allowances in VStitcher. For more information, check out the Browser Help Center.